stories are psychologically privileged, which is really nice. Straight away, I'm thinking, well, the problem we have here is that if our stories aren't accurate, then children are probably likely to remember misconceptions far easily. Sorry, they're most likely to remember, misconceptions far more than the truth. So, what other pitfalls should we try to avoid when we're utilizing story in our classrooms?
Nice. I mean, that's a really good one because we know how difficult it is to overwrite misconceptions. So there's probably a lot to that. I mean, my major pitfalls come from some of the traps on a whole school level that we might fall into. For instance, it doesn't need to cost thousands of pounds to utilize story in our classroom. We don't need to buy specific stories or specific books because they've been written with a slightly educational twist to them. Obviously, there's very good reasons for spending thousands of pounds on books generally, but the desire to use narrative structure as part of your pedagogical arsenal isn't one. Because there will be instances where stories are used in place of strategies that we know have quite high efficacy in the classroom. So the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, and story becomes the only vehicle for our instruction. And sometimes because so often when you say a story, that's what comes to mind. I'm going to use this story about this subject to as my teaching tool, and I don't think that's what we mean. I think it's about supplementing what we do with what we know about the ways in which stories can affect us in the classroom. And hopefully that's what I'm trying to convey in my answer to the second question, is giving here the ways this might connect with what we do and what we know is effective, or is, I think what's the new phrase? A good bet. Because it was best bets for a bit, and now it's a good bet. And so, what we reckon is a good bet in the classroom, and we don't replace it with what becomes a slightly groovy, to use the parlance, groovy solution to a problem that no one posed. So we do everything through story, and then we actually end up doing nothing but disadvantaging our already those children who are already disadvantaged. So those would be my two big pitfalls. Don't spend an absolute fortune on stories that you don't need, and don't spend time on practices that are less likely to support pupils in actually learning. Yeah, so I think there's a distinction. If I get one thing across, it's the distinction between using stories as the only pedagogical tool, and using what we know about story to supplement our pedagogical tools that already exist.
Yeah, great advice. Again, and something that I wish I had listened to a little bit more in at points in my career. Like, is story useful for this thing? I mean, it's easy to lose sight of the purpose of what it is you're trying to achieve, particularly if you've got this nice little story that you've thought up to explain a thing, and then you realize it doesn't explain the thing quite as well as you hoped it would, but you like the story, so you still use it. And that's something to avoid, not losing sight of the purpose and ending up, and equally squeezing stories in to explain things where it doesn't necessarily quite work. I think it would be remiss of me not to mention, because I talked about history and geography and other areas of the academic curriculum, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention how that can go wrong in certain cases, particularly with history, where we end up attempting to tell what feels like a single coherent narrative. There is an extent to which, for example, it's worth joining together British history and saying, look, there is a flow to this, there is a sense of continuity. But if that becomes, this is the story of Britain, say, then we're probably getting ourselves into trouble. Equally, if we're talking about geography and we're talking about, say, as I mentioned, counter-urbanization or urbanization or whatever it might be, if we focus on one place as an introduction, we can end up with a limited view of what that concept is if we don't then expand beyond that and say, well, this story is this is what happened perhaps in one place, or this is one way of looking at what happened in this place, but it's more complicated than that, or there are more facets to it than this. So yeah, trying to avoid the idea of a single story, particularly in areas like history and geography, is something to keep an eye out for, I'd say.
Yeah, I think, especially everything that's going on with the, Black Lives Matter and all of that stuff. It's quite easy to take the Western viewpoint. I remember there was an advert. I can't really remember what it was advertising, but it looked like someone was stealing an old lady's bag. But actually, when they flipped the perspective of it, actually something was falling that you couldn't see in the first instance. So this person was rushing towards this old lady and like trying to look like taking a bag, but actually just trying to wrestle her out of the way. And obviously that advert has always kind of really stuck with me in terms of that, how important it is to flip that perspective, and making sure that both sides of that coin are given the opportunity at least to kind of experience both sides. I think that's really important, particularly where children seem to very quickly get this idea that all of Africa is a particularly poor continent and things like that, and that's clearly not the case. I just think for me, because I say part of the reason why I wanted to do have this conversation was because I just thought, when they're saying this, surely they don't want me to spend my time thinking about full-on narratives for every minute objective that I need to teach. And so clearly, I didn't think that's what you meant, and obviously I'm glad it's not what you meant. But as I say, perhaps it is just me, but whenever I hear, oh yeah, we teach something through story, the first thing that my mind goes to is these full-on narratives, and it's clearly so much more than that. I was able to find the book, my granddad's book on Gutenberg.
Yeah, I just saw that.
It has great titles like George, who played with a dangerous toy and suffered a catastrophe of considerable dimensions. So once you've read that story, it's not going to go well for you. And then it ends with Charles Augustus Fortescue, who always did what was right and so accumulated an immense fortune. And when you want to do
what stuff from this author, like it a lot.
Yeah, you want to do what Charles. I mean, it sounds like a Tory MP, doesn't it? I mean, it probably is the kind of thing that Jacob Rees-Mogg was brought up upon. Charles Augustus Fortescue. But yeah, it's in the chat, so definitely worth. Wouldn't recommend using it in the classroom, but a bit of fun.
Yeah, just use it with your own kids.
Yeah, just scare the
yeah, absolutely.
Kids, yeah.
I was just thinking as well, Kieran, what you said about how the idea for the project was to create a website for all these stories, and I'm just thinking, if only you were part of an organization that had objectives mapped out in a sequential way where you can add pedagogical notes, and so you could go in and offer story or different possible stories for which to teach these things. But we'll have to wait a little bit longer for that, I think
so. I mean, am I right in thinking you've started adding storybooks to the science curriculum? Is that right?
Yeah, where appropriate, if I can see a book about that links, so whether that be, I can't remember the names of the series, what's the people who really
Great
good
Lives, like
great,
etc.
Yeah. So like the Great Lives. So all the scientists that are in there, there's a link to their stories there. So the Charles Darwin one, the Marie Curie one, the Mary Anning one. There's a lovely book to teach about natural selection, the Moths book, which is basically it's for year 3, I think, but I think that's what it's targeted for. But obviously, we don't teach evolution until year 6, but it's in there just because that the story of the moths is and the Industrial Revolution, and how there were some white moths and some dark moths, and the population changes after the Industrial Revolution, and the all the smog that was pumped into the countryside. It's an easy one. It's an easy hook. So yeah, coming soon to a science curriculum near you.
So arguably that's something that we didn't get a great deal of time to, or we didn't touch upon, which is the idea of, we talked about narrative mainly within a lesson, I would say. I mean, I think we talked about it, but there's obviously an element of this that relates to curriculum development, the wider idea of, from year 1 to year 6, again, avoiding this idea of a single story, what is the story that we're trying to, or stories that we're trying to get across, or across a topic or across a year group or whatever it might be?
Like a really good box set, some might say.
Yeah, some might suggest even.
I did a talk on that recently. And yeah, because you're saying, oh yeah, you wanted to know more about a story, but surely you've contributed one of the biggest sort of parts of this conversation in the idea that you've got within an example, within a set of questions, you've got a story, within a lesson, you've got a story, within that's a story as part of a much bigger story. And then, like you said, the story goes even further. And you know, when it's really well written, it doesn't make sense if one of the pieces that, you know, is out of kilter, you know. So, you know, I mean, what's your take on this?
You're the experts in this one. No, honestly, this fully deserves to be one of the most listened to Staff Pay episodes in a long time because it was fascinating. I think, you know, I find it quite, maybe it's because I'm not a natural writer of fiction, and I'd be interested to see if those people who write fiction more, or certainly read a lot more fiction. I am not a massive fiction reader at all for my sins, whether they find this process easier to do, because for me, it's a very cognitively thinking of what these stories might be and these structures it's certainly a cognitively demanding task for me that I kind of think, well, maybe it's just easier if I just tell them.
Yeah, I mean, ChatGPT.
ChatGPT, yeah.
You know, I don't know if anyone subscribing to that once it goes, you know, is it £1,000 per letter or something? I don't know what the model is.
It's £1,000 per letter, we're in trouble.
No, I don't know. Don't quote me on that. That might not be the actual price. Yeah, but it might be you feed it enough information about I mean, you already know about the underlying concept.
Yeah.
So could you describe this through the vehicle of a story? In fact, I might do that. That might bring the website to fruition because you own the copyright of anything that it writes for you, don't you? So maybe have a look at that.
Have a look and see how it does. But yeah, no, I think, yeah. And
one thing I was thinking earlier about with ChatGPT, because Sylvia's got this set of texts that she has to, that are aimed at kind of like year 10, 11. So they're actually quite tricky, but they're just maths texts, and she wants to use them with classes that are struggling readers. And I think, like, copy and paste that into ChatGPT, type what reading age you want that to be kind of translated into and a rough length that you want it to be abbreviated to, and Bob's your uncle. And then I immediately thought, well, hang on a minute. We've got to create it. Let's say you're a school and you want a load of non-fiction texts for whatever X, Y, and Z. I mean, you could just say, "Oh, tell me stuff about this subject," but I would imagine put it and pitch it at the right level. But equally, if you wanted a certain feel to it, you could just copy something from the Encyclopedia Britannica, copy it into ChatGPT, say, reword this. And now you've got something you're allowed to photocopy 30 times by law, I would imagine, as long as you don't tell anyone that that's what you've done.
Well, you better hope it's not one of the most listened to episodes.
Yeah. I think I still have that digital copy of the Art and Science of Primary.
Oh, but I was about to say, you take a chapter of that, you chuck it in there, out it pops at the other end, just as well written, if not probably slightly better written, and then you can like photocopy it and share it to your heart's content.
But then the Malaria Consortium would lose out, Chris.
Yeah, they'll cope.